Thank you all for joining us today. We'll get started in just a few minutes after allowing some time for people to join. Thank you all for joining us today. I'll now turn it over to ASH's Executive Director, Laurent Hubert.
Hello, and welcome to this webinar on how to use environmental law as a vehicle for protection from secondhand smoke. Today, you will hear concrete examples from Israel, Spain, and the United States. This webinar today is co-hosted by ASH and nofumadores.org in Spain. Before I introduce the speakers, some quick housekeeping issues. You can type questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and feel free to direct them to a specific panelist. And so I will, with any further ado, we'll get started, and I will introduce the first panelist. First panelist is Amos Hausner, an attorney and tobacco control advocate, who will present existing environmental laws as well as tort law provisions that can be utilized to prevent secondhand smoke exposure in the home, a theory about to be tested by an application to the Israeli Supreme Court. Amos, the floor is yours, and you can start sharing your screen.
Okay, now unmuted.
Yes.
Good.
You're unmuted, okay. Yes.
Good. So here's the story. We have this problem of smoke, tobacco smoke, that penetrates your apartment from the neighbors. I mean, what can you do? It's your apartment. You're supposed to control the air in your own apartment, but you cannot, because there's some smoke penetrating from the others, from the neighbors. And what I'm going to tell you today is that in most cases, already existing laws that are in the law book govern this situation. And you can use these provisions in order to avoid, to eliminate, to make sure that you are not exposed to tobacco smoke against your will. How does this work? I'm talking about norms that are in the law book that refer to certain situations that regulate rules of behavior among human beings, with the general principle that prevails in the situation is that there is no safe level of exposure to tobacco smoke. This is a governing principle, meaning that if you're exposed to tobacco smoke, if you smell the tobacco smoke, that means that tobacco has already reached you. The tobacco can smell you just as well. And therefore, in this situation, certain laws that are already there in the law book govern the situation and can protect you. What do I mean by that? First, I'll start with general environmental laws. You know that in the last few decades, people are aware of pollution, of air pollution, and they passed laws against it. The law are twofold. Some of them can say that the exposure is unreasonable. Well, if there are toxins of tobacco smoke, and again, there is no safe level of exposure, it's unreasonable. other way of making the pollution forbidden by law is by quantifying certain ingredients. Now, most laws include ingredients that are already in tobacco smoke. We're talking about formaldehyde, we're talking about benzopyrene, we're talking about carbon monoxide, we're talking about particulate matters, we're talking about heavy metals such as cadmiums. You're not supposed to breathe all these. And here in tobacco smoke, you get them all concentrated. And this is why it was determined by the World Health Organization that there is no safe level of exposure. So we have this principle of environmental law. Now let's get to the other law that is also a criminal law, and it is sanctioned all kinds of human behavior that harm the humans. For instance, it refers to noise, it refers to injury. Any kind of these laws are already criminal. Like for instance, in Israel, this is already forbidden by the criminal law of 1936, the ordinary criminal code. And it was reenacted in Israel in 1977. So we already have two laws, both of them criminal laws, that are in control of this situation. The other one, and I'll give you a little spoiler here, it was already recognized by the Supreme Court of Israel, the highest legal instance in the country, in the hearing that took place when I initiated a petition, an application to the Israeli Supreme Court regarding this second home penetration to homes. And this is about odor nuisances, smelling, against the stench of tobacco smoke. So here we are not necessarily talking about damage, but we are talking about the fact that you are exposed to the nuisance, to the odor, to the smell of tobacco. Already 3 ways of protecting you from tobacco smoke. The fourth way is also a criminal definition of assault. You know, as in assault and battery and attack. When we are talking about assault, then the common law definition of assault includes the operation of any material, such as gas, such as smoke. And it was already recognized by courts in the United States, in Israel, that involuntary exposure to tobacco smoke can amount to such assault. And this is also a criminal violation. The last one that I will mention is the definition of behavior among human beings in personal injury laws. Personal injury laws, like tort laws, are defining the way that individuals treat each other. And they already include such torts, such harms, such as private nuisance. And when there is a private nuisance, you can sue. You can prevent the private nuisance just as you apply rules that govern of behavior of people in multi-unit housing, land laws. And this way, you have another way of protecting individuals. So let us talk now which authority you go to in order to enforce your right to breathe clean air in your own apartment. And this all depends on the specific law, the respective law in which you are going to use. For instance, if you are talking about an environmental law, then you go to the environmental agency, like the Environmental Protection Agency, or in Israel, it's the environmental government ministry for the environment. If it is the criminal norms, then you go to the police. In Israel, it's Inland Home Security. If it is this injury law, like the personal injury law, then it is your job to apply the court to give you the relief known as an injunction or restraining order in order to prevent your neighbor from this kind of behavior. And if this didn't work, you can ask for a compensation. Why compensation? Because things happen. Because, and this was proven in one of the Israeli cases, your life expectancy is shortened due to the exposure to this secondhand tobacco smoke against your will. And because also proven is that the value, the commercial value of your own apartment is damaged too. Who would like to buy? Let's assume that you want to sell your apartment or to rent it out. Who would go there when they go inside and see that all day long they will be exposed to tobacco smoke? So here we have these laws, we have the agencies, and let us see how they work. I mean, in most jurisdictions all over the world, I mean, we've all more than 180 states and countries that ratified the FCTC, the World Convention on Tobacco Smoke. So they have good laws to ban smoking in public places, but we're not talking about a public place. So these laws do not cover you. They do not protect you. In order to be protected, you really have to revert to the type of laws that I just mentioned. And when I mentioned these laws, I didn't mean that all of them have to apply. It is enough that one is enough. And if it is the correct one, it will give you the relief. It will give you the remedy that you are seeking. Further, you don't need more than one. One is enough. If one is enough, go ahead, use it. Go check the law book, and I'm sure that you will find some provisions already in the book. Questions. For instance, what about the fact that there are laws dealing with smoking already and they do not include exposure in your own apartment? Sure, they don't. They handle specific situations. And in the hearing in Israel on January 26, it was a snowy day here in Jerusalem. So this is why people remember this day. It was already decided that the fact that the laws which ban smoking in public places do not refer to these situations does not mean that the bans are not valid. As a matter of fact, the court also specified the ban on other nuisances as the one that is the easiest to apply. I wonder if this is the case in other countries, but we can check with each country its respective laws. Let us check another question. Does the fact that these laws do not mention either tobacco or smoke, does it hurt the application of these laws to these situations? No, it does not. As a matter of fact, many types of litigation that already took place do not mention the tobacco smoke altogether. I'll give you several examples. Let us start with the Department of Justice in the United States under the Clinton administration, filed in 1999. Again, the tobacco companies under what is known as the mafia laws, the RICO laws. So when they speak about, in the RICO laws, when they speak about relief, the United States relied on a law that did not mention smoking, that didn't mention tobacco, it mentioned the mafia. And when the tobacco companies lost, they had to publish special apologies because they violated this law that didn't mention smoking or tobacco at all. What about the 50 states of the United States that wanted to get compensation? And they did, $246 billion from the tobacco companies. They relied on laws dealing with fraud, with concealment, with a conspiracy to commit a crime, nothing to do with mentioning tobacco in the law. What about the administrative case of ASH, Action on Smoking and Health, that filed a lawsuit to get equal time for advertising when it was allowed in the electric media in the United States, and they won what they wanted, $400 million worth of advertising in today's values, when the John Benza, founder of ASH, applied to these courts. And what about Article 19 of the FCTC? The Article 19 also gives you this opportunity. Criminal law, they say, criminal law against tobacco companies for actions they committed. Putting all these together, we reach the conclusion that we can use laws in this respect that do not mention tobacco at all. Another issue, what about what they say that the people who smoke do it in their own territory, in their own apartment, in their own yards? Does this matter? Does this give them any kind of protection? No. that was already decided centuries ago. One of the leading cases is under the British law, it's called Mayor of Bradford versus Pickles, that one is not allowed to do in his own apartment, in his own house, something that will hurt his neighbors. It's against the law to do something like this. So the fact that the person doing these acts, exposing others to involuntary smoking, does not protect this person from being prosecuted. So on the basis of all these principles, I filed exactly a year ago, on February 28, 2021, an application to the Supreme Court against the ministries, the respective ministries. The hearing was, as I said, on January 26 this year, and the court ordered the government agencies, they gave them 90 days to come forward with a solution to this problem. Now, don't get me wrong, I am not suggesting to work against the respective government offices and against the agencies. I suggest that as much as possible, work with the government, work with the agencies. All I am saying is that you do not have to reinvent the wheel. You do not have to enact specific laws in order to resolve this problem, in order that people will not be involuntarily exposed to tobacco smoke, not against their will. They are already in the law book all over the world. And I suggest that we all get together and use it. And my final point is this. The World Health Organization has scheduled that this year, the World No Tobacco Day will be dedicated to tobacco and the environment. And I suggest that when we do that, we shall also focus on the nature of tobacco smoke as a pollutant, as a violator of good, clean environment. This is a good opportunity to do that in this specific year when World No Tobacco Day is dedicated to the cleanliness of the environment. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amos. And thank you also for reminding us of Article 19 of the FCTC, which has been on many, they're concerned that we actually don't use it enough. And thank you also for showing us that we can be very creative and we don't have to reinvent the law. But let's go now, there will be plenty of time for questions, I think, later still. So let's go to the next speaker. It's Raquel Fernández Megina, who's the president of nofumadores.org, who will discuss how to use environmental arguments to advance in outdoor smoke-free areas, and we'll base it on the experience in Spain. Raquel, the floor is yours.
Hello. Do you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay.
The screen
you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay.
But if you could maybe put the presentation, perfect. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, there we are. Well, thank you, Lauren. Thank you for inviting me to be here with you today to explain you how to use environmental arguments to advance in outdoor smoke-free policies and what we did in Spain. Well, we live in a world where the tobacco industry not only has a license to kill, but also to pollute, to poison the planet, and it does it at zero cost. But we are also in an historical moment where environmental movements are very strong and have penetrated deeply into our society. That's why it's an ideal time to use these movements, to work with them, because they have a special strength and interest among young people. And we have to use them to advance in smoke-free outdoor policies, revoking this way how tobacco industry, revoking this tobacco industry's license to kill and pollute, because by achieving those sustainable spaces, environmentally speaking, we also achieve healthy spaces. So what did we do in Spain and what did we achieve? Well, in 2018 at nofumadores.org, we are a tiny NGO with almost zero resources. Well, we identify an opportunity to work in this direction because, well, Spain is a country which is formed by a peninsula and 2 archipelagos. That means we have like almost 8,000 kilometers of coastline. At that moment, there were some local initiatives that sought to promote smoke-free and cigarette butt-free beaches. We saw those initiatives in Galicia, Catalonia, Canary Island, but that only meant 3% of our coastline or of our beaches. So that summer, we decided to launch a campaign in Change.org called "Make All Spanish Beaches Smoke-Free," and we did it in Spanish, searching for local support, but also in English, looking for that international support, since tourism has become the sector that contributes the most to the wealth of the Spanish economy. So the initiative took off the ground quickly, since we know that there's a huge support for these kind of measures among the population. So since we launched this campaign, the smoke-free beaches, the number of smoke-free beaches has been increasing every summer. So we have passed for those 91 when we started to 525 last summer. 525 last summer. But now comes the tricky part, and that's that except in the case of the Canary Islands, where there were fines for smoking on the beach, in the rest of the smoke-free beaches, this has just been an initiative with educational purposes and to raise social awareness. Where there were no sanctions for not compliance, therefore the compliance hasn't been as good as it could have been. Well, it's obvious that this kind of measures and these programs have meant an advance which has helped to raise awareness among the population and also to empower citizens to demand compliance and smoke-free outdoor areas. But now a step forward is needed, and that means we need fines, because without them, the measure is not as effective as it should be. So our first idea was to send the signatures to the health ministry, and that's something that we did in several occasions since we started gathering them. But when the Ministry of Ecological Transition started working on a new law called Waste Law for Contaminated Soils for a Circular Economy, we saw there an opportunity, and we decided to send them the signatures to them too. That was at that moment we had 284,000, and actually it was the first time someone told them that the cigarette butts in beaches were a way of polluting. And they were quite impressed of the degree of concern that citizens had toward this problem and this kind of waste. And they saw it through the number of signatures that we sent. Obviously, in order to success, besides contact with the government, we also needed to contact with the groups on the position in the Congress. So that's what we did. And we sent them the signatures too and the idea. And thanks to that, one of them took the idea and introduced an amendment to part of the original text. The original text said in this article, to prevent the generation of waste, the competent authorities adopt measures whose purpose will be at least the following. Stop the generation of scattered garbage in the marine environment as a contribution of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal of preventing and considerably reducing marine pollution of all kinds. To this end, from the entry into force of this rule, the city councils may regulate the limitation of intentionally releasing balloons, and those are the 4 words that got introduced, smoking on the beaches. it's interesting how the government thought that balloons are a kind of waste and never thought about bats being a waste that should be banned from beaches. Anyhow, I continue. Smoking on the beaches, which might be sanctioned in the municipal ordinances in accordance with the regime of infractions and sanctions of this law. The minor infractions in this law are up to 2,000 euros, which is a quite high amount of money. Well, this law at the moment is in the process to be approved. It has already passed the Congress and is now in the Senate for approval. It's expected to be to enter into force next July. So after this new law passes, we solve the main problem that all these smoke-free beaches programs had, and it was like they were not fine. So now, relying on this law, the city halls will be able to fine for smoking on the beaches. And notice that what was introduced in the text was not that littering with bats was banned, but the smoking on the beaches. So that helps also with our health issue. So as I say, that will really back this measure. Will give it the definitive backing to be fulfilled. So we all know that to ensure that laws are complied with, it's needed to go through the pockets of the citizens. Otherwise, none other law will be complied. Obviously, once the law is approved and enters into force, we still have to work to convince those city halls to develop municipal ordinances that introduce fines for smoking on their beaches based on this new law. But obviously, we are in a good position to start with. As a conclusion, this has been achieved by civil society. The government has done the easy part, which was just listening to social demands and legislating accordingly. We all need to know that in this war, it's important to use another argument other than health to win as many battles as possible. That's something that us has been doing perfectly lately, using arguments of human rights. So just to end, I present you our next goal, which is national parks, tobacco, smoke, and bats free. So far, we have up to 59,000 signatures. So we'll see what we get with that. And that's it. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to respond to your questions afterwards.
Thank you, Raquel. And I have a few questions that I see there's a few, so that we'll discuss more of this. Our next speaker is Georg E. Who's a professor of psychology in the College of Science at University of San Diego State University. He will discuss policy and legal implications for the protection from secondhand and third-hand smoke exposure. Georg, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me. Over the past 40, 50 years, we've learned a lot about secondhand smoke, but secondhand smoke does not just disappear into thin air. It leaves behind a residue. That residue we call now third-hand smoke. I'll tell you a little bit more about the origins of third-hand smoke and then focus on important differences and implications of third-hand smoke, differences compared to secondhand smoke. And I'll finish with an overview of some of the regulatory and policy implications that we've encountered here in California. So what is third-hand smoke? Well, we know a lot about secondhand smoke. It consists of thousands of different chemical compounds in the form of gases and particles. It travels very easily through the air to neighboring apartments. We get exposed to it through inhalation. And on a time scale, It occurs within minutes and lasts for minutes, perhaps 20, 30 minutes after somebody has smoked, depending on ventilation. But secondhand smoke does not simply disappear. It becomes and is the precursor to third-hand smoke. Third-hand smoke is that chemical residue that we can sometimes smell on a smoker or in a room where smoking took place. It's that residue that remains in indoor environments, that can get re-emitted, that can off-gas, that can be resuspended from the dust where it collects, and that chemically ages. By that we mean these compounds can continue to react with ambient oxidants and yield potentially harmful, in fact, novel products, chemical products that were not present in freshly emitted smoke. Importantly, exposure to third-hand smoke takes place not just through inhalation of these off-gas components, but also through dermal transfer, by touching, by wearing clothes, and through ingestion, through putting things in our mouths, through oral intake. And critically, third-hand smoke lasts for hours, for days, for months, and in some of the cases that we've studied, it can last for years after a smoker moved out of a house, for instance. It contains, so far we know of, more than 15 carcinogens and reproductive toxicants, many of which Amos mentioned earlier, including heavy metals, including tobacco-specific nitrosamines, large mass of nicotine, as well as polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. It is highly persistent in indoor environments where smoking is common. We've all seen, smelled, and experienced third-hand smoke. I'm going to just give you a brief overview. Here is a home where people have smoked in. That residue will last for years.
ההרצאה שלו על העשן יד שלישית היא מעניינת.
Here are some plates that were polluted. You can wipe it off. Here's a sofa that we cannot smell, thank God, but that has accumulated a lot of residue. It also affects toys. It sticks to the smoker herself or himself, the clothes, the skin, the hair. It ends up on paintings. This is what a dentist might see, and we've probably all seen residue on the hands of a smoker. So here are some of the key differences compared to secondhand smoke. Secondhand smoke exists and pollutes the air. We get exposed to it through inhalation. Thirdhand smoke, the reservoirs where these pollutants collect are compounds that are off-gassed into the air, but also surfaces of furniture, carpets, materials, bodies of clothes, building materials. Inhalation is one form of exposure, but also ingestion and dermal transfer, the latter two particularly important for children. Second major difference, time scale of exposure. We can remove secondhand smoke through ventilation fairly efficiently. For thirdhand smoke, that is not possible. The time scale of exposure can be chronic. It can remain for weeks, months, and years, and is one of those compounds or mixtures of compounds that we often refer to as forever chemicals, depending on the depth of the reservoir and the duration for which smoking has taken place. Transport is also important for legal regulatory considerations. Secondhand smoke, it's air movement, as Amos pointed out. For thirdhand smoke, it involves the objects that can be moved, the cars that can be sold, the furniture that is handed down, as well as the movement of smokers who can carry third-hand smoke pollutants into smoke-free environments, as has been demonstrated for a movie theater, for instance. Number 4, remediation. How do we remediate secondhand smoke? Well, we impose smoking bans, we increase ventilation, and we get rid of the secondhand smoke. That does not work for third-hand smoke. For third-hand smoke, we need to wash, we need to clean, we need to wipe, we need to vacuum off the dust that remains, and in many cases, we need to replace the polluted furniture. We need to remodel and rebuild, demolish. And then there is a last important difference, and that has to do with disposal. For secondhand smoke, there is not really an issue of disposing polluted object, but that is for thirdhand smoke. What do you do with a sofa? What do you do with building materials? What do you do with the carpeting that has become embedded with these tobacco smoke pollutants? Eventually, they end up on landfills where they contribute any number of carcinogens and reproductive toxicants to the landfill. So here are some policy implications. One has to do with closing existing loopholes. There are in existing law a number of indoor settings where smoking is allowed when non-smokers are not present. I'll give you an example in a second of childcare facilities where smoking is allowed when children are not around. Designated hotel rooms for smokers, where you as a non-smoker may have to stay if there are no non-smoking rooms available. Rental cars that have been smoked in, not when you're renting the car, but before. There are work environments. We've come across a number of cases of truck drivers who share vehicles. The previous driver may have smoked cigars or cigarettes, and then a non-smoker comes, uses this truck, and gets polluted to that residue. In, I want to say in 2014-15, in California, AB 1919 was introduced that bans smoking inside family home care centers, even after the children had left. Until then, adults could smoke after hours and on weekends, as long as children were not present. In recognition of this persistent thirdhand smoke pollution, this was banned. And there are other environments where I think we need to close loopholes and ban smoking when an indoor environment is used by non-smokers at other times. There's a big issue of consumer protection. And Amos pointed this out, value of real estate decreases, value of used car decreases, but consumer protection extends to things like housing, pre-owned cars, furniture, clothes, toys, peer-to-peer commerce. In California law, for instance, requires disclosure in the sale and lease of environmental hazards. I think this is an issue that can be further pushed to include tobacco smoke polluted objects. And of course, there's also fraudulent misrepresentation in the sale of real estate. California also has, for real estate transactions, a residential environmental hazard booklet that until now does not include tobacco smoke pollution, but it should. There is a transfer disclosure statement where environmental pollutants have to be listed. That could be an important vehicle. In California, the public appears to be ready for such action. We did a flash poll exactly a year ago and found out that more than 90% or about 90% or more of people who smoke and do not smoke are in favor of disclosure requirements for homes and apartments that they might be renting. People want to know because it matters to them at the time they sign a lease or at the time they buy a home. That's an important vehicle. We can strengthen indoor smoking bans. In California, there are now many multi-unit housing buildings that have smoking bans, but their implementation often lacks. So we need to figure out how to eliminate exemptions, how to implement them better, and how to build a series of progressive consequences and contingencies to move people from smoking allowed to tolerated to completely non-smoking. This is an effort that the US Department of Housing and Urban Development started in 2016 for low-income housing, but they also encountered a number of implementation problems, including exceptions for electronic cigarettes and exceptions for units, for low-income units that HUD subsidizes that are located in mixed finance projects where there are also regular priced housing in the same building. Another important vehicle is housing code violations, a regulatory mechanism. Currently in California, I'm sure in many other countries too, home inspections check for lead and mold, but they do not check for carcinogens and toxicants that are associated with tobacco smoke residue. I believe that under California law, we can leverage such housing code violations to help protect consumers, renters, and buyers from persistent tobacco smoke residue. This would also have implications for developing testing methods and standards, as we have for lead, for instance, and to develop best practices for removal and remediation. And then finally, environmental impact, as I mentioned. In this apartment that you just see here, this carpet has become a reservoir, a deep reservoir of carcinogens. What to do with such polluted objects? The wall boards, the gypsum boards are deep reservoirs for pollutants. What do we do with these? Well, under California and federal law, the disposal of toxic and hazardous waste is regulated, similar to cigarette butts, as they constitute toxic and hazardous waste. But these building materials belong to this class as well. I think we need to figure out how to leverage these environmental laws, state and federal laws, to protect and figure out what to do with these polluted objects here. And finally, I want to thank you and encourage you to visit our Third Hand Smoke Resource Center website at thirdhandsmoke.org. You'll find lots of interesting infographics. There's a lot of signs, there are news and updates, and frequently asked questions. And I want to leave you with something humorous, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Georg. So we will move on now. We will have time for Q&A session. Again, you can type your questions into the Q&A box, and you can feel free to address them to a specific panelist. Okay, for a second, I thought it was, and we will also have, we probably will be joined by Kelsey Romeo-Stoppy, who's a staff lawyer at ASH, in case there is any contribution she has to make to the to this discussion. So my first question, first one to you, Raquel. It's really exciting, this what's happening in Spain, and finally having basically an enforcement mechanism where we, you know, where 2,000 euros, that's approximately 2,200 US dollars, so a fairly high fine. But you said there's still an important step, which is to convince city halls to then enforce it. Do you anticipate any problem with this, or do you think that there will be it should be a fairly smooth process, or do you think it might be 22? You know, the law comes into force in July of 22. We might take us a year of advocating with the city halls.
It's gonna be a very slow process because we have so many different municipalities in our coastline. So there are like many local governments will have to introduce that kind of ordinances in their legislation. So they are not forced to. They can do it, but they are not forced to. So I don't see that that's gonna happen overnight. It's gonna take time, and not only a year, probably a few. I mean, what we were searching for, what we're looking for, was like a national law that will, not make us to have to go to every local government, but that's what we have so far. So it's a start. Obviously, it's better than we had before, but still national law will be needed.
And do you have any champions at this stage? Do you have any city halls who are willing to champion that? So do you have one that's willing to do it and be the model for others that we can call on?
We are pretty sure that the Carabasí beach in Elche might be one of the first ones. We do have someone from nofumadores.org who is very present in that community, and we're pretty sure that they will probably be one of the first ones.
So there's work to do. And I wonder, I'll have a question that maybe later, but for Kelsey to see if there's any pressure that can be used through human rights mechanism or others to pressure Spain on this. But before this, I'll go back to the point that both Georg and Amos made on the basically the devaluing of a home, for example, because of third-hand smoke. I remember after graduate school, the first home, we rented a home that had been used by a smoker. And it took literally weeks of professional cleaning of walls and everything to have the place be livable. So you mentioned that, for example, in California, at this point, there's no third-hand disclosure when selling a home. Is this something that could be, for example, the California EPA could mandate this, and is what would be required for that to happen?
Very good point. There are a couple of avenues to move this forward. One is to work with Cal EPA to add to their transaction requirements, real estate transaction requirements, information about tobacco use or testing results. There's also an amendment, an update that could be done to the environmental hazard booklet that provides education and information. And then there is a separate route for legal action that could lead to the specific naming and mentioning of tobacco smoke pollutants, and perhaps standards for actionable levels as well, and remediation activities. So these are three different avenues that we're currently proceeding. I think the lower hanging fruit is probably through EPA updates and amendments to the regulatory framework that does not have to go through legislative action.
And when you said legal action, that would be then brought on by a citizen, by a group of citizens. What would be the ideal case?
Perhaps I misspoke. I meant to say legislative action. There's legal action that is going on as well, and we were actually involved in 3 lawsuits where buyers of homes sued real estate agents and the former and the seller because of lack of disclosure. So these legal actions, case law is ongoing simultaneously.
Okay, so that's still on pending, so that is not concluded yet.
Some of the legal actions have been concluded, and there have been settlements in the 6-figure area. There were mediation efforts for others, and there's one lawsuit that's still ongoing in Superior Court in LA. Okay,
so there are precedents oh, very good. Amos, do you think that the case in Israel could be a precedent for other countries to use environmental law in the same fashion?
I believe it will be, because what we use are principles of either common law, and you know that there are many common law countries where they have traces of British law, such as India, Kenya, Australia, Canada, but even in countries that they follow continental law, the Code Napoleon, or even where they have completely different ways of the law, such as Japan, for instance. I guess these are general principles of human behavior. I'm not talking about something, you know, that was just taken from the air, from the clean air. It is just general norms of behavior. And this is why a precedent made in Israel, I believe, will serve as a precedent for the rest of the world. This has nothing to do, you know, with specific Israeli legislation. This is what's so nice about it.
Great. That would be a wonderful example of Article 19, which is the article in the FCTC that encourages countries to use legal frameworks to protect the health of their citizens, or the country's citizens, from the tobacco industry. Kelsey, if I could ask you, in the context of Spain, for example, with this, it's really, really unique now, having really the teeth. But my concern will be that, as Raquel mentioned, it might take some time to move this forward. What would be your recommendations for Spain, things that they could do, and for example, on the use of a human rights mechanism, for example, to create some pressure?
So it's going to depend a lot on different things, how the law is structured, what remedies there are under that law. So each country will be a little bit different, but from a human rights perspective, any country that has the right to health in their constitution, which most do now, I think that's a very compelling argument that both tobacco is harming the environment and people's health, and that's a good argument to move up to a superior Supreme Court in Spain and elsewhere.
And Spain definitely has the right to health. It's clearly integrated in the Constitution. Then I have a question from one of the attendees. What about smoking regulations in home constructions and workers, which is something, unfortunately, I too often see, and particularly I'm in Spain right now, and in work sites, cigarette butts everywhere. So what panelists, what are your thoughts on that? Amos, and then Raquel and Georg, what are your thoughts on that, on smoking in workplace, and could environmental law be used in that context to ensure that those workplaces, those construction workplaces, which are outdoors, do not become a big ashtray?
Well, it's a good, really a good point, for the construction works. And as we know, when we say about smoke penetration, from one apartment to another, it does not necessarily have to be in open air. It could be, for instance, in certain holes that are in those walls that are not well taken care of, they're not well connected, and air certainly penetrates, this way from one apartment to another. So when you're talking about those construction workers, so exposure there, I mean, you can be really eternal. That's what you mean, right? And once again, I mean, the only solution is elimination. And remember, when I said before, when I gave you these examples of collision between tobacco and the law, this is not coincidental. I mean, tobacco kills half the users when used exactly as directed and intended by the manufacturer. This is when they're hurt. It's not something that could not be foreseen. It is something that was actually foreseen. And this is why there are so many ways that the tobacco collides with the law. And the only way I'm afraid to say, that there wouldn't be such collusion, it's not just, construction workers, it's just that tobacco shouldn't be at all. I'm sorry to say that, or maybe not so sorry.
Great. Georg, do you have any additions, please?
Yes. So workplaces are interesting because there are a lot of regulations for workplace smoking, but they mostly concern indoor environments, that you cannot you cannot smoke in offices. But the loopholes involve, for instance, transportation, as I mentioned, car interiors. There are very few restrictions on those, and then outdoor environments. So in the construction context, there's definitely a tobacco product waste problem because people throw away the cigarette butts, but there's also the problem of the tobacco that's being smoked polluting the new clean materials that are being used to build a home. So you're starting a home and you're already polluting the wall boards and the insulation and the flooring and the ceiling tiles with tobacco smoke. So in the context of house construction, it definitely should be prohibited, and that's a loophole. I think that should be closed as soon as possible.
Very interesting point. Our friend Francesco Rodriguez Lozano from Spain pointed out that there is in Las Palmas in Gran Canaria, so in the islands in the Atlantic coast, west of Africa, that are Spain. They already have a fine of 200 euros for people smoking and littering on beaches. Then there's a few very good questions here. There's one that I think I'd like to maybe like to hear other. It's been answered, Amos. You answered it in writing, but I'd like for others to hear, and it's for you. It was to you, Amos. The information you presented shows a great deal of legal ammunition that is available to citizens to be protected against secondhand tobacco smoke. How might this be made be made disseminated and used to motivate many persons on a large scale to take appropriate legal action. So what could we do to encourage more people to use those potential legal mechanisms, including, for example, the assault charges, et cetera, et cetera. And I see that Kelsey would like to respond to that. Amos, would you like to go, please?
Oh, absolutely. I guess we have to use all kinds of opportunities that were, for instance, when we mention No Tobacco Day, that actually mean environment that is free of tobacco. And this way we can get people people could be aware of the ammunition that we provide them. I mean, if in Israel, for instance, the decision of the Supreme Court or the decision of the government to follow what the Supreme Court suggested for the government to go ahead with, if this is followed, then everybody will know about that. So once we take this measure, once as such societies, such as Action on Smoking and Health, maybe cancer societies, maybe heart associations, as long as they take this avenue and try to disseminate this information to the public, everybody should be aware of that. I mean, in Israel, they found out that 50%, half of the population is exposed to this problem of secondhand smoke against their will. That means a lot. We're talking about millions of people that are not satisfied with this situation. They hate this situation. All we have to do is just to get them organized, be aware of their rights. I mean, this issue of the application was mentioned in the Israeli media already 45 times. So we are doing, I guess, well. It should be done in other countries as well. I guess we'll be successful then. Thank you.
Kelsey, notice you had your hand up earlier if you would like to add to this.
Sure, yeah, I wanted to answer this as well. I think one of our big problems in tobacco control is that it isn't sexy. People aren't interested as much as they used to be. A lot of people think the problem is solved, particularly young people. And I think the environment is very trendy and very sexy, for lack of a better word. And I think that to get people outraged about tobacco, tying in these environmental arguments is really effective, particularly for younger generations. I think people are appalled when they hear that cigarette butts are the #1 littered item. And we've experienced that with our human rights work as well. Not a lot of smokers think of themselves as human rights victims, but when you start talking about it that way, it really flips the perspective. And I think there's a lot of
you muted. We cannot hear you now, Kelsey.
I just said that I think with human rights, people have really caught on to the idea that as a human rights victim, it's very different than thinking of yourself as a smoker. And there's a lot of possibility for that with environmental law as well.
Good. Our last question will be for Georg. Any regulations regarding the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendations that parents smoke outside and wear a smock that is not brought into the house or a car? Are you aware of any of this? I know one of our former board members out of Kimball Physics, a company in New Hampshire, was actually not allowing employees or others go in if they had smoked, and that as a work policy. But I was wondering if you know if there are any regulations coming from the AMA or any medical groups.
There are no regulations that I'm aware of, but I'm aware that a growing number of hospitals no longer hires staff members who smoke, because when they go on smoke breaks outside, they bring back into these protected high-risk environments tobacco smoke pollutants. And we were just contacted recently by a mother who had a son in the hospital with asthma attacks, who was cared for by a nurse who stepped outside, smoke, came back, and her child experienced an asthma attack on a regular basis when this nurse came back. So I think there is a growing recognition that there are, especially in healthcare environments, that this is a situation that needs to be remedied, and so that's one of the, I think, initial steps towards this.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much all for your statements. So if you would like to have, if you Raquel, Amos, and Georg, if you just your last few words that you want to communicate with the attendees, but if you could keep it under 1 minute, because we're just on the hour. So if the last words, Raquel first.
Well, just as I said before, we really need to use those laws based on environment because the movement is very strong, and we can make some advances there regarding health, public health.
And so as you had pointed out in the past, also, it's a wonderful way to bring new people into, bring the environmental groups and others into the movement, the tobacco control movement.
Exactly.
Amos.
Well, I would like to emphasize this point, that since so many people live in these multi-unit housing apartments, then because it's also a question of health inequality, of health disparity, because the people who suffer most from this problem of incursion of smoke into their own homes are people of low income, people who cannot afford their own homes, their own houses. They just live in these apartments because they have to. And this is why when they suffer most. And since this is a problem of most of the people in the world, I guess that they should organize and put pressure on the respective government agencies to go ahead and prevent this nuisance. They have the law, they have the possibility, all they need is to go ahead with it.
Good, very good points. Georg, final words.
After 6, 7, 8 decades of pretty liberal indoor tobacco use, tobacco smoking has left behind an extraordinary toxic legacy in indoor environments that we will have to face. Because even if we were to ban tobacco today, that residue, that legacy will be with us. And it's particularly prominent in indoor environments as well as in outdoor environments.
Thank you. Well, thanks. I want to thank again all of the panelists for taking the time and all the attendees for joining us today. And our next webinar will be on March 24th on the economic impact of tobacco use. And also I encourage all of you to go to our tools for advocates on how to use human rights mechanisms to advance tobacco control. Actually, we have a very exciting work going on. There will be also in the United States. The United States is one of the countries that has ratified the Convention Against Racial Discrimination and is due to be reviewed this year. So that will provide a unique opportunity to engage. France also, which is due to report to the Convention Against all Discrimination Against Women. So that provides an opportunity there. And we are doing a lot of work in that area to bring that link and also bring the human rights movement, which also ties to development, environment, and so on and so forth. We don't have to do this tobacco control work alone. We can do it with other mechanisms that are there for us to use, and it will be an accelerator to help us implement the FCTC at country level. So again, thank you very much, and I look forward to be with you again on March 24th for our next webinars. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful day, morning, evening, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.